Welcome to another video. So we're almost at a point where we can start to write our last Lambda function that will handle redirects. However, before we do that, we want to spend some time with API gateway. By default, when you drag over a resource or API gateway from the enhance component section, you get a REST API, which is a lot more robust, and I find it to be maybe a somewhat of an overkill for most applications. I tend to use HTTP, which is a lot more lightweight, faster, and it's a lot easier. And it's a nice way to break into writing YAML template if you're new to this. So we're going to go ahead and change this from a REST to a HTTP. Now, one limitation of the composer, and this may be hopefully a feature that's added in the future. If we double click on the API, we're not able to change it here, and we'll have to write some manual script for that. Also, if we collapse the enhanced components, and the difference with enhanced components is these resources you're able to drag over, change the properties, and connect them to other resources. And we can just delete this. While if we look at enhanced components, they're really just scaffolds of the actual template. So if we drag a resource like this, and if you look at the process properties, you may get some code that you get to start off with, and you can modify on the template. Now we're not able to delete this from the UI either, so we need to go into the actual template code and remove this resource. So we're going to follow something similar to these and write our own HTTP API. Now, one limitation of writing our own resources that doesn't live inside of the enhanced components, we will lose the ability to drag and drop. So once we change this, we won't be able to connect the API to Lambda using this feature that we have here before. However, these code for Lambda functions are pretty identical, and the HTTP code template is very simple. So let's go open up our code in VS Code, and we're going to remove the REST API. So if we look in resources where we have URL shortener service, I'm just going to copy the name. We'll keep the name the same, but we can highlight all the way down to max age. And we can actually go ahead and delete this. And let's write our own template here. So we're going to keep the same name and make sure the indentation matches. That's one thing with YAML that you'll probably run into. So we want to keep that. And like all resources, you'll start to see a typical trend in the syntax, right? You have the logical name for the resource, the type, and the properties. So let's follow this. The type will be AWS, Serverless HTTP API. And now we can add our properties. One pretty common one is the name, and we're going to use some built-in SAM function or CloudFormation function to dynamically create a name based on the stack name. And that just makes sure as you create additional resources, there are no naming conflict. You can also enter a name right here as well. So we're going to follow this since this is how most of our resources have been created earlier. So let's just stick to that syntax. And we're just going to have a list of strings that will concatenate together using sub. And this is just a string that will give a value later on from stack. And this will dynamically get your stack name. And let's give this a value. And we're going to call that, let's say, API. And we also need a stage name. Now we can hard code the stage name, or we can actually introduce something that we haven't looked at. So let's right before resources, we can have parameters, and those are like values we can refer to in any part of our stack. So let's add a parameter, and this will call it stage name. Type will be string, and we can actually give this a default value of dev. Now, if you use any type of automated tool to deploy your code, you could inject these values at runtime, especially if you're deploying this to multiple environments. But we'll treat this as dev for now. We have our resource, stage name, and we have our HTTP API. Now we do need to go back to the individual Lambda functions and make sure we're pointing to the correct type of resource. And in our earlier, when we use REST, these were API. Now they are HTTP API. API, and this should be API ID instead of REST API ID. Now we need to do this for all the Lambda functions. So let's go to our delete URL, HTTP, and this should be API ID. And let me just make sure I have all the functions. Again, this is our create URL, HTTP, and this should be HTTP ID. And if I save that and go over to the Lambda, if you do get any error like this, we just need to make sure our syntax is pretty correct. So let me load file again, or it's saying API, so it hasn't took effect yet. So this should say HTTP API. So let me refresh this, and I'll just open project if it doesn't load. Make sure point to your project folder, view files, and create and save changes. We're still getting that. Okay, so here we have our stage name, which should be on the same indentation as name. That's probably why it was screaming at us. And that's just one thing you'll see as you work with YAML files. It does take a while to get used to, and that's where application composer comes, gives you some flexibility of getting a good start. So here it's saying serverless HTTP API, and it will show the connection based on the code. However, if let's say we drag over a Lambda function and we try to maybe create a new endpoint, it's not even showing the routes, even though there are routes. So if we try to do maybe test and save, we'll get some errors because this is not fully supported yet. So of course, we still have the flexibility to connect our Lambda functions, and that's what we'll do in the next video when we build out our redirect.